They said the coast grew fat on other people's labor, that the sacks of sugar and tobacco, the barrels and bales that moved from Bahia's plantations to distant ships, sat heavy with a wealth no one who bent to carry it ever saw. The house with its whitewashed columns and tiled veranda stood like a map of that wealth. Rooms for counting and rooms for keeping, a ledger's shadow that never touched the quarters where the children slept. Anna knew those shadows as early as she knew the sound of her mother's voice, low, threaded with a music that tried to smooth the edges of fear. Her mother's hands were large and rough from years of work. They cupped Anna's face and taught her how to listen for the wind, as if it were a language that could warn them when the master's horse came by. She was 6 when they took her mother across the road at dawn. The wagon left a dust halo that swallowed the path. Tomei, older by a few years and already protective by habit, held Anna so she wouldn't run after the sound of the wheel. Afterward, the house felt smaller, as if an entire wall had gone missing. Tomei took to waking before the small hours to make sure the door latched. He taught Anna names for the fields so she could imagine the world beyond the boundary posts. They found comfort in the song her mother left behind, a repeated line, a hum beneath the cotton sun afternoons, a way of keeping one another whole in pieces. The song said, "Remember, hold, wait." The order of the plantation was precise, ceremonial even. The colonel moved through it like a man who believed the world could be maintained by rules written on paper and enforced with the same exactness. He kept an iron on a shelf in his office as one keeps a seal. It had the look of an instrument and the look of a relic. Men who belonged to him did not speak against him. They learned silence in different ways, some by breaking, some by bending. Tomei resisted breaking. He gathered the other boys by the mango tree and taught them how to make a rope swing from discarded cordage, how to tie knots that would not slip, how to listen for the patterns of the overseer's patrol. He traded his small comforts for something he could never sell, audacity that passed unnoticed until it did not. One morning the list came for transport. Names were read like an inventory. A hand wrote across a page and someone was gone. Tomei's name was called. Anna's legs turned to salt. She tried, with the rawness of a child, to hide in the poultry house and to become part of the clucks and straw. They found her there with her knees tucked up to her chest and dragged her out by the shoulder. She watched the wagon take him. The song her mother had left felt suddenly small and brittle in Anna's throat. The first time she ran, she thought she could chase the wagon with footsteps that imagined themselves long enough to catch the world. She lasted 3 days in the forest, eating guava and sleeping under the hush of leaves. On the 3rd night, men tracked her. They carried torches that smelled of pitch and fear. The torches cut the dark into thin slices. They brought her back by dawn. They did not kill her. They brought her before the colonel, who was as precise as ever in an economy of cruelty. He ordered the branding as if naming a new possession, and the iron came down like a sentence. The iron was not a momentary pain. It was a geography. It pressed into skin and stole the voice that had been the shape of her mother's song. Her scream was a hot, bright thing that emerged like a spark, then collapsed into a silence so deep it became new. After the iron, Anna learned to be silent with intention rather than with fear. She kept the scream folded somewhere inside her ribs, a small embered thing that she would feed later with other fires. She was 16 when they burned the mark into her shoulder, and she carried the heat of that day as a private weather. The scar sat like a map on her skin, a darkened line that friends would study in the shadowed moments before sleep. The colonel displayed the iron now with a different pride. It was a tool that taught obedience and a relic that whispered his domestic order. Silence suited a certain kind of survival. Anna learned to make herself small in rooms where smallness equaled safety. She listened instead of speaking. She learned the exact cadence of the kitchen's pots and the names of herbs in the servants' shed, because knowledge was a hiding place. Even then she kept a plan. Rain comes, the people said, and rain hides footsteps. She waited for the season when the rivers swelled and the patrols slackened their stride. She learned to count nights like one counts breath. The second escape arrived like a slow tide. She left at a time the soil smelled of wet ash and the sky closed over in an oil sheen. The forest accepted her as a fragment of something else, a child bearing weight no longer held by the house. After many nights, countless, indistinct, she found them. A settlement folded into the trees, smoke and laughter and work braided together, people who had chosen another order. They watched her for a long while, before a woman with hands like carved wood and a gaze that could sort truth from performance stepped forward. Zephyrina led them, her head held steady, her voice the sound of a rule that was not imposed but chosen. She tested Anna only with a look. Anna lowered her eyes. Zephyrina nodded. Benedito was the first to offer a hand that did not grip in command. He walked as if he knew the forest's rhythm, and he taught Anna to move without leaving a trail. Constanza, who ran the herbal corner of the settlement, worked with roots and leaves as if they were letters that spelled out life. She taught Anna how to make salves for the fevered, how to read the color a plant showed for the sign it wanted to give. Elias sat near the smoke with a book resting on his knees and a chalk scratch on his lip. He had learned letters by stealing minutes in the dark while other men slept. He held those letters like birds that could teach a person to sing more than one song. Joaquim, older than memory and a keeper of stories from places beyond the present, told of Palmares in a voice that trembled with both pride and the ache of loss. His tales were not romances. They were fragments of names and roots, broken treaties, and a long, stubborn refusal to vanish. The Quilombo they joined was not a utopia. It was precarious, a map of small economies and shared burdens. They debated who should wake at what hour and how to distribute the receiver of news. Sometimes new faces came and left. Sometimes men were taken in the night by patrols. Sometimes the small fields failed. Yet there was a steadiness to the way they sweated and stitched, to the way the children learned the names of plants and the rhythm of the river. Anna learned to read with Elias, letters turning into words, and words like hands that could shape a life. She took to Constanza's herbs with a patient hunger, learning which roots meant sleep and which could banish the ache of a wound. She learned that knowledge can be stitched into a person as neatly as a seam. Life in the Quilombo taught her a different kind of voice, not the blinding song of grief, but the low register of doing. She learned to patch an ankle with a string and to spot the first fever in a child's eyes. She learned to watch the horizon for the sign of soldiers and to talk of routes that the planters believed were safe. When they were raided one season, a raid that came with fire and the smell of oil in the night, Anna saw how fragile they were. The defense was not about winning. It was about choosing who would go on. They lost, they moved, they rebuilt. Anna's hands hardened in ways that did not make them less tender. She stood when it mattered. Someone held her afterward and spoke softly to measure the weight of what they had done. Years passed in the long count of work and teaching. Time in the Quilombo did something to Anna that her brand had not been able to. It taught her to be more than an echo of what had been taken. She became a woman who knew the names of herbs and had the patience to stitch a map from memory. She also learned to keep a quiet ledger of grievances and possibilities. The mark on her shoulder remained. It was a dark, familiar country. It made others look twice, and sometimes it kept men respectful, as they oriented their gaze away from someone they could not claim. She did not seek glory for her scars. She kept them like a private language. Then, after 12 years from the day Tomé had been taken, fugitives began to arrive in the cover of dusk. They came by different routes, overlands, rivers, hidden paths, tired and carrying news in the worn seams of their clothes. The group that arrived one humid evening filled the clearing with murmurs. Among them was a man who looked like Tomé, but older. His hair had grayed at the temples, his hands showed new lines, his eyes had learned the economy of trust. Tomé moved with a war's caution, quick, precise gestures, an untrusting pause before he allowed himself the humility of dinner. When he recognized Anna, he did not rush to her at first. He watched her, catalogued the change, how she sat, how she laughed, how the scar sat like a badge on her shoulder. Their reunion was not a ceremony. It was a careful fitting of pieces. Tomé told them about the roads, about captains who took bribes and men who kept records of who passed, about the names that were safe and the names that were not. He had learned to move the spaces between plantation houses and riverbanks so the patrols would not notice a body that wanted to pass. He brought news. A colonel's brigades had been reorganized. A new overseer had been given a pension. The iron remained in the colonel's house like an object hanging on a shrine, a reminder. Tomei's information folded into Anna's long plan like water, meeting a dry channel. They did not speak much of revenge then. They spoke of routes, of times when the colonel would be away, of who might see a stranger in the kitchen and think nothing of it. They planned slowly with the patience of people who had lived by counting breaths. Patience was their ally because impatience made noise. Philo, who had once worked in a plantation kitchen and knew the rhythm of a house from the inside, how servants spoke, how they carried pots, which day the colonel walked the dogs, offered to help. She knew where the keys were kept, who polished the silver, and which window could be left unlocked by an overseer who always trusted his own habits. The Quilombo supplied a small network of eyes and hands. Some would bring information, others would stand watch in the river and signal, some would be ready to take Anna back if things went wrong. They all knew the stakes. The act that would settle a score would not erase the past, but it might alter the ledger. Anna was 28 when she returned to the plantation. She went dressed as a kitchen helper, carrying a basin and a cloth and a voice that had learned to be measured. The house smelled the same, wax and the faint sickliness of preserved meat. She walked with the ease that comes from working with pots and patience. The colonel, older and still believing in order, did not suspect the smallness of the woman who came to rinse his silver. He greeted her with a nod, the nod of a man who admired predictability, and she answered with the right tilt of head. The iron sat where he had left it, on a shelf in the office, like a holy object kept for its power. It had the look of history and the look of a tool that had been used to write obedience into skin. Anna's days were composed of observation. She learned the pace of the household, which servant came to replace a pan on the coals, when the colonel read his ledger and when he dozed with the fan resting in his hand. She noticed the exact hour the colonel took his solitary walk through the yard, the cadence of his breathing when he believed himself unobserved, the little rituals he performed that made him feel in control. She watched the iron from a distance often. At night she would return to the place she rented outside the fence and meet with Tomei and Philo by a riverstone. They compared notes. A bird had sounded in the wrong place, a carriage would be at the market on a certain date, the colonel's nephew would be at a tavern on a night when the colonel would drink alone. There was no swagger in her movements. She did not tell herself stories about righteousness. She kept repeating in a private sentence that she would not allow herself to rehearse aloud, that she wanted to make the ledger reflect what had been done to her, a correction of accounts, not a triumph of cruelty. Inside, the old scream sometimes pricked like a buried thorn, but she had learned to translate that pain into quiet machinery. She worked the kitchen pots with a calm that came from years of mending other people's wounds. The night she chose was a night of small things aligning. The colonel had received visitors earlier and had partaken in wine until his speech softened into a slow pool. The house's servants had been shifted for the visit, and his nephew was away. The moon was a thin coin in the sky, and the patrols were fewer than usual. Philo had arranged for one of the cook's helpers to be out sick. A prearranged absence offered a small window of unremarked movement. Anna carried with her a heated object she had learned to make from a metal worker's suggestion, an iron brought specially to resemble the colonel's own. She had practiced the act in memory, not with rage but with the precision of someone tending a wound in the dark. The room where the colonel slept smelled of the old perfume of laurel and old paper. He lay half asleep, a hand dropped from the bed as if in trust. Anna stood by him with the iron warm in her palm. She did not shout. She did not offer a speech. Her hands were steady because they held a plan made in nights of river mapping and route learning. The iron touched skin in the same gentleness and finality with which hers had been touched years ago. The heat was immediate, bright as a struck flint. He made a sound that was not a scream. It was the sound of surprise moving through a mouth unpracticed in humility. The mark she made was not to equal pain with pain. It was a notation, a seal that would say, in a language of skin, that he was no longer unassailable. The aftermath was quieter than any spectacle. The colonel did not fall dead at her feet. He lived in a new way after that night, careful, humiliated, prone to sleeplessness. His body, which had been used to command movements like a map being read, altered its course. People spoke in the small houses and the small markets, and the rumor of what had happened crept like river mist into corners of conversation. The plantation watched, roused a little, then folded away again. The colonel lingered, a man who had been forced to consider himself in a way he never had before. He died months later. The reasons were given in gentle euphemism: failing health, a fever that came too quickly. No one said that a man might die sooner because the ledger of his life had been altered. When Anna met Tomei again, the meeting was a braid of small gestures. He took her hand with the practiced caution of a man who knew how to test for traps. They did not dramatize their reunion. Tomei's embrace was long and silent. He let his forehead rest against hers, feeling the scar like a map on the other side of the ledger. They spoke in low phrases about roads and rivers, and a child who had learned to read small letters in the shade of a fallen palm. The words did not try to wipe away the years. They tried only to make a map forward. Anna considered what to do. The Quilombo had given her a life that was hard and honest. It had taught her how to heal and how to teach letters to small children with hungry eyes. The plantation had taken much, and had also given her something she had returned to claim and alter. There was no satisfaction that could stitch time back together. The colonel's mark on her was not removed by her mark on him. Justice had not performed like a miracle. It had been quiet and contained and chained to consequence. She could return to the Quilombo and fold back into the life she had built among people who had chosen one another. She could move north by river and try to begin again somewhere else. She could walk like an old stories traveler and see where the road ended. She did not decide immediately. For some nights she slept outside the fence under the same faint sky and listened to the trees make their patient language. The mark on her stayed forever, the darkened line that made people look twice when they noticed it. Children in the Quilombo would point at it and ask, and she would tell a trimmed version, that sometimes people make marks to keep one another from making more marks, or that a mark is a story you carry, so you do not need to tell it again. Years went by with the slow logic of repaired things. Some friends from the Quilombo stayed, and some drifted away. Joaquim died telling, as he had always done, a final story of Palmares to a group of younger ears that listened with reverence. Benedito took to leading small groups along safer rivers. Constanza continued her work with roots and leaves, and Elias gave his letters to children who would go on to read maps and lists and perhaps avoid brutality with the instrument of literacy itself. Anna kept moving. She came back now and then to the house where she had been marked to remind herself that return could be an act of composition rather than destruction. She helped those in need, and she taught the children in the Quilombo how to stitch small things together. Tomei and she would sometimes sit by the river and let the water name the shape of their talk, not always speaking, but being present in the way the water carried things downstream and did not hold tight. There was a conversation among them once under the shade of a tree about scars and stories. Joachim's grandson, no longer a child, now a young man with the taut hands of a man who has lived with risk, asked Anna if the branding had made her whole. Anna touched the scar and smiled, a thin, private smile that did not mean triumph. "It marked a place," she said, "where someone thought they could write what I was. I corrected the line, but the correction is not a story of victory. It is a part of how I remember." She looked at Tomei. He nodded. For them, memory was not a ledger of debts and credits alone. It was a map of choices, whether to respond with the thin, bright violence of a single action, or to take the slow route of rebuilding and teaching, and being present to those who came after. When the story reaches others, when someone sits down and hears how a girl was branded, and how she returned 12 years later to mark the man who had marked her, it can be read as a tale of straight revenge, or as a more complicated ledger. This is not a story that recommends imitation. It is a story that knows oppression teaches people desperate arithmetic, and that sometimes those pressed into corners will use the only numbers they have to alter equations. It is also a story of community, of Zephyrina's leadership, of Constanza's healing, of Elias's letters, of Benedito's eyes in the trees, of Joachim's memory, of Philo's knowledge inside the house. The Quilombo held the possibility of another way of living, not perfect, not safe from sorrow, but full of tools and names, and the slow work of learning to make a life. If this account touches you, stay with Anna a while longer. Subscribe for more stories that listen to the small, stubborn histories of people who lived and chose within impossible orders. There is an image that returns when people tell this story. The iron on the shelf that once belonged to the colonel, the same kitchen where Anna moved like a shadow, the river stones she sat upon as she met Tomei again. There is the sound of a woman's hands on a plant, learning the language of leaves, and the hush of a child being taught how to form an A and a B on a slate by Elias's careful hand. These are the things that make a life go on. She did not leave an epitaph on the colonel's memory. He died in a softened way, the world saying his forgettable last words, and the register of his life closing. No triumphal drumbeat marked his end. The plantation kept on under new hands, and the rivers cut new paths as always. The community returned to work. They mourned and rebuilt and remembered those who were gone. Anna's final act was not the end of a ledger, as much as the rounding of a number. The scar on her shoulder, the scar she left on him, these were like brackets in a long accounting. She had been branded with a hot iron at 16. 12 years later she returned to settle the score. The sentence, simple and heavy, becomes in the telling a truth of how people choose to carry weight. Her mark remained, a testimony that the body remembers what words sometimes cannot hold. The Quilombo survived in its imperfect way, carrying seeds of memory from Palmares through Joaquim's stories and the letters Elias taught. People continued to learn the names of plants, to watch the river, to pass on the song her mother had hummed in the early mornings. In the end, she chose not to turn the moment into a proclamation. She let the mark be a line in her life, and not the headline of it. She moved forward into an uncertain world with the knowledge she had gathered, that some answers arrive slowly. That knowledge of letters, of roots, is a river that can carry you beyond the edge of an immediate wound. She kept her options open. Sometimes she walked north by river, sometimes she returned to the Quilombo, sometimes she settled for a while in a house by the sea where she taught a child to spell the name of a root. The future remained indefinido, as all futures are when lived in the shadow of history. People will ask whether what she did was right. The question will never have an answer that fits like a coin. Rightness is a public ledger that seldom accounts for private needs. What remains true is this: scars name the past, and sometimes the act of naming is fought for with the only means at hand. Anna's life after the iron was not a simple restoration. It was a process, slow and full of small, deliberate acts of repair. Her story resists clean endings. It holds the complexity of survival. Branded with a hot iron, she wore that mark as one wears a sentence, a fact that shaped the manner of her breathing and the measure of her steps. 12 years later, she returned to settle the score. The return did not erase what had been done. It altered its course. It added a footnote to a life that had already contained many. The mark became part of the story she told the children she taught, the one that said, "Remember the pain, but learn the roots. Do not make only one kind of map for your life." If this story stirred you, there are notes and background readings linked below that speak to the lives of Quilombo communities, to the art of healing with plants, and to the slow power of literacy. Consider reading more and share the tale with someone who wants to listen to the hard, patient rhythms of survival.